The morning Clara Whitcomb brought the first load of mules through Harlan, every head in town turned. Her father's faded blue pickup rattled past the diner with an old livestock trailer behind it, patched with sheet metal and tied shut with baling twine. Through the slats, people could see gray muzzles, scarred knees, cloudy eyes, and tired backs that had already carried more years than anyone wanted to pay for. By noon, she came back with another load. By 3 o'clock, she came back again. When the last trailer crossed the cattle guard at Whitcomb Bend Farm, Clara had bought 29 mules nobody wanted. Not young mules, not matched teams, not pretty animals for parades. These were auction leftovers, stiff-legged, sway-backed, marked by old harness scars, the kind people looked at with pity before turning toward something younger. At the auction gate, the hauler looked at her twice. "You sure these are the ones you paid for?" Clara held the checkbook against her coat. "All 29. The man gave a short laugh. "Most folks buy animals that still got a job left in them." Clara looked through the slats at the gray faces watching the rain beyond the sale barn. "They do," she said. Across the pen, Mason Pike heard her. He owned cattle across 3 ridges, with red gates, tight fences, and hay barns that never leaked. He was not cruel, but he had the kind of practical voice that made hope sound foolish. "Clara," he said, "your daddy ever tell you what feed costs in June? He taught me to count before he taught me to drive. Then count this: 29 mouths, no good crop in the ground, a banknote breathing down your neck. That is not a plan. That is grief-wearing boots." Clara signed the receipt and put it in her pocket. "Maybe," she said, "but they're coming home with me." By sundown, all of Harlan had heard. Men slowed their pickups near her fence. Boys on 4-wheelers laughed from the ditch. At the diner, coffee cups paused halfway to mouths. At the feed store, someone said Walt Whitcomb would have stopped her if he could still talk right. Clara did not answer any of them. She drove the mules home to a farm that looked almost as worn out as they did. Whitcomb Bend sat low under 2 old oaks, 86 acres of tired pasture, washed hay ground, broken fence, and a barn leaning toward the creek bottom. The corn crib had lost half its siding. The old International tractor sat dead behind the machine shed. Down by the water, the creek bank had broken away, leaving sycamore roots hanging in the air. Beyond that creek stood the only county bridge connecting Whitcomb Bend and 6 other farms to Harlan. That bridge had been there so long most people stopped seeing it. Clara had not. For weeks, she had watched water curl around its concrete footings after every hard rain. She had seen cracks under the rail and gravel washing out from the base. She had noticed how the creek no longer rose slowly the way it had when she was a child. It jumped now, brown and fast, carrying branches, foam, and topsoil from fields upstream. She had walked the creek bank at dusk, with her father's notebook in one hand and her grandfather's faded map in the other, staring toward the wooded ridge behind the barn. But nobody knew that. All they saw was a 24-year-old woman with a failing farm spending, borrowed money on 29 retired mules. Clara's father, Walt Whitcomb, had once been one of the steadiest farmers in Harlan County. He was never loud, never rich, but he could read a pasture by its color and hear trouble in a tractor before a mechanic found it. For 30 years, Whitcomb Bend paid its bills. Then the weather changed. 3 wet springs drowned the low fields. Summer storms cut gullies through the hay ground. Feed prices climbed. Fuel prices climbed higher. The tractor transmission failed in the middle of second cutting. Then Walt collapsed beside the equipment shed. He survived the stroke, but he came home quieter. His right hand trembled. His words came slow and uneven. The bank letters came fast. By winter, Clara had left her agriculture classes at community college and moved back into her childhood bedroom. She had no brothers to split the work, no husband with a second income, no new machinery, and no cushion left at the bank. Mason Pike had offered to buy the farm twice. He wanted the land, but he was not only greedy. His own father had lost land in the 80s, one field at a time, to interest rates, drought, and pride. Mason had been 17 when the last piece sold. He still remembered his mother crying in the truck outside a lawyer's office while his father stared through the windshield. From then on, Mason believed there were two kinds of farmers, the ones who sold early enough to stand back up, and the ones who waited until the bank sold for them. So when he looked at Clara, he did not see courage first. He saw the old disaster happening again. One evening, he stood on her porch with his hat in both hands. "I'm not here to pressure you," he said. Clara stood behind the screen door. "Then why are you here?" "To make sure you know you have an option before the bank decides you don't." "This farm is not an option to me." Mason looked past her toward Walt's chair near the window. "That is what worries me," he said. In March, the bank gave Clara 90 days to bring the loan current or present a real operating plan. Mr. Ellison, the banker, looked over her pages. Feed costs, trail repairs, veterinary estimates, mule care schedules, possible emergency hauling fees. "You are asking this bank to believe 29 retired mules can keep a farm out of foreclosure," he said. Clara folded her hands. "No," she said. "I'm asking the bank to believe I know what this land is for." Mr. Ellison did not laugh. The town laughed enough for him. At the feed store, men said she had traded a broken tractor for 29 broken animals. At the diner, they said she was farming backward. At the gas station, someone called out that she ought to buy a buggy next and start delivering mail like it was 1910. The county extension agent came out in April with a clipboard and boots that sank in the damp yard. "Clara, you need income. You need lower costs. You need something the bank can understand." She looked toward the ridge behind the barn. "They'll understand when they need it." "When who needs it?" Clara did not answer. She only kept working. Before daylight, she fed the mules. After breakfast, she checked hooves, cleaned old hides, and worked each animal into halters. She learned them the way her father used to learn soil. Amos was steady but slow. Ruth was strong but hated straps near her flank. Moses followed anything if Amos went first. Red Jack tested every gait. Bluebell, a narrow gray molly with one cloudy eye, froze whenever the ground changed under her feet. By mid-April, Clara began taking them up the old ridge trail. It started behind the barn, climbed through sycamore and oak, bent around a limestone bluff, crossed a saddle in the hill, and came out on an old logging road leading to the high county road beyond the creek. When Clara was little, Walt had called it the Ridge Line Cut. He used to tell her that before the bridge, her grandfather had hauled flour, medicine, fence wire, tools, seed, and mail over that ridge with mules. Most of Harlan had forgotten the trail existed. But Clara's grandfather had not. His notebooks were still in a cedar chest at the foot of Walt's bed. One entry from 1973 stopped Clara cold. That spring, the old bridge washed out completely. For 9 days, farms west of the creek were cut off from town. No truck crossed, no ambulance crossed, no feed wagon crossed. Only the mule line moved over the ridge. Her grandfather had drawn the trail by hand. He marked distances, resting spots, safe loads, a spring near the saddle, and a warning beside the steepest descent. He had written one sentence in darker pencil than the rest. "When the road fails, the ridge remembers." Clara read those words while rain tapped the kitchen windows. A new tractor would not help if the bridge went. A bigger loan would not help if feed could not cross. But 29 steady-footed mules on a forgotten trail could turn old family knowledge into the only road left. Still, knowing that did not make the work easy. Bluebell nearly broke her. The first time Clara led her onto the limestone shelf above the creek, the mule froze. Rain had darkened the rock and made every root shine. The shelf was not wide, and beyond it, The hillside dropped through trees toward the water. Clara held the lead rope loose, the way her grandfather's notes had instructed. Never drag a scared mule. Let her think. Come on, girl, Clara whispered. Just one step. Bluebell jerked hard enough to burn the rope through Clara's glove. Clara fell to one knee, stone cutting through her jeans. Bluebell backed toward the drop-off, eyes wide, nostrils white. For one terrible second, Clara saw both of them going over. She let the rope slide. The mule stopped. Clara stayed on the wet rock, breathing hard. Every instinct told her to pull, to force, to prove she was stronger. Instead, she remembered one line from the notebook. A mule trusts patience. So Clara sat still. Rain dripped from her cap. Blood warmed her shin. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Clara took a bruised apple slice from her pocket. "That's all right," she said softly. "I wouldn't trust me yet, either." Bluebell's ears flicked. Then the mule lowered her head. One hoof moved. It landed on the slick stone with a small, careful sound. Clara did not smile until the second hoof followed. That night, with swollen fingers, Clara wrote in her notebook, "Bluebell crossed wet limestone. Do not rush her. She remembers fear, but she also remembers kindness." The work went on. Clara repaired cracked pack saddles, soaked old straps in oil, carried sandbags, before trusting the mules with feed, cleared brush with a bow saw, and marked the trail with red cloth. She dragged fallen limbs off the path until her shoulders burned. She cleared the old stone culvert near the saddle, one bucket of mud at a time. Her hands split at the knuckles. Her boots stayed wet for days. The bank account shrank. At night, she sat at the kitchen table with overdue bills spread in front of her while Walt watched from his chair, unable to say everything in his eyes. One rainy evening, Clara nearly gave in. The barn roof leaked in 3 places. The feed bill was due Friday. A new bank envelope lay unopened beside the salt shaker. Outside, water sheeted across the yard. Down in the pasture, the mules stood under the shed roof, gray shapes shifting in the dim light. For the first time, she imagined Mason Pike's offer as relief instead of defeat. No more bank letters, no more broken machinery, no more neighbors waiting for her to fail. Behind her, Walt's cane tapped once against the kitchen floor. She turned. He stood in the doorway, unsteady but upright, the old cedar notebook tucked under his good arm. "Your granddad," he said slowly, "never kept notes for history." Clara looked at him. Walt swallowed. He kept them for whoever came next. The next morning, before sunrise, Clara was back on the ridge. By June, the mules no longer looked like auction leftovers. Their coats had improved. Their steps had steadied. The trail was tamped by hundreds of careful hooves. At the saddle near the spring, Clara stored hay under a tarp. On the high road side, she hid water cans, rope, first aid supplies, and a shovel in an old deer blind. Then the rain began. At first, it was an ordinary June storm. Then it stayed. By the second day, ditches ran full. By the third, water covered low crossings, and the radio warned of stalled storms over the Ozarks, flash floods, closed roads, and more rain before nightfall. Clara walked to the bridge at dawn in a yellow raincoat. The creek was no longer a creek. It was a wide brown force pushing logs, branches, fence posts, and uprooted brush against the concrete supports. The bridge rail shivered. Water slapped the underside with a sound Clara felt through her boots. The sheriff's deputy lifted one palm. "Bridge is closed." Mason Pike stood near the rail, soaked through his canvas coat. On the far side, his cattle bawled from a hill lot where floodwater had swallowed the lower pasture. "How long?" Mason asked. The deputy looked at the boiling water. "Long as it takes." "We've got feed on the town side." "So does everybody." Mason turned and saw Clara. "You really think that ridge trail is passable in this?" Clara looked at the creek, then at the hills behind her farm. I don't know yet. By midnight, Clara could hear the water from her bedroom. Before dawn, a deep cracking sound rolled through the valley, followed by a metal scream and a heavy splash that shook the farmhouse windows. Walt woke in his chair. Clara was already pulling on boots. When she reached the road, half the bridge was gone. One span had dropped into the creek, twisted sideways, with water boiling over it. The asphalt ended in a jagged black edge. The bridge everyone trusted had become a broken thing in a brown river. The west side of the creek was cut off. 6 farms, 2 elderly households, more than 300 head of cattle, and a whole community that had always believed the road would be there. Calls started before breakfast. Feed could not cross. A woman on River Road needed heart medicine. A calf was down in Mason Pike's upper lot. The volunteer fire department could see the houses from the other side and reach none of them by truck. By 9 o'clock, everyone was looking toward Whitcomb Bend. Clara was already in the barn. The mules stood tied in 2 rows while rain ticked against the patched roof. Pack saddles hung from beams. Canvas panniers lay open. Clara moved without hurry, because hurry made mistakes, and mistakes hurt animals. Medicine was wrapped in oilcloth. Feed sacks were split into balanced loads. Ropes, canned food, batteries, syringes, and dry socks went into separate bags. Walt stood at the barn door, leaning on his cane. He touched the old wooden sign Clara had found in the loft. Whitcomb Mule Line. Clara had not hung it yet. She had been waiting, though she had not known for what. The first crossing nearly failed before she reached the saddle. She took Amos at the lead, then Ruth, Bluebell, Moses, Red Jack, and 4 others behind them. Each mule carried half-loads wrapped tight in canvas. The rain had thinned to mist, but the trees still shook water down. Every stone seemed alive under Clara's boots. Halfway up the ridge, they reached the place she had worried over all spring. The trail narrowed beside a washout where runoff had eaten the downhill edge. Under flood rain, it had become a ribbon of mud no wider than a kitchen table, with the creek roaring far below. Amos stopped. Behind him, the line compressed. Leather creaked. A pannier bumped a tree. Bluebell snorted, and that nervous sound moved through the animals like wind through dry grass. "No," Clara breathed. "Not here." She moved down the line, touching necks, checking knots, speaking each name low. If one mule slipped, the others could panic. If they turned back, the medicine would not reach River Road, and everyone would know the girl with the mules had been wrong. Then the mud under Ruth's back hoof gave way. The mule lurched sideways. A canvas bag swung out over the drop. Clara threw herself toward the load, grabbed the lower strap, and slammed her shoulder into Ruth's ribs. Mud slid under Clara's boots. Ruth's eyes went white. Bluebell pulled backward. "Stand," Clara said. It came out rough, almost broken. Ruth trembled. "Stand." The mule froze. Rainwater ran down Clara's face. Her fingers were trapped under the wet strap. Inch by inch, she pushed the swinging bag back against Ruth's side. The load settled. Ruth found the trail again. Clara cut a young cedar from the uphill side and wedged it across the washed edge like a rail. It would barely hold a man, but it gave the mules a line between path and emptiness. She returned to Amos and placed one hand on his jaw. "Easy now," she whispered. "Think it through." Amos lowered his nose to the mud. He tested the first step, waited, then placed his weight. Ruth followed, still shaking. Bluebell came third, ears pinned, breath loud, but she did not stop. When the last mule cleared the washout, Clara leaned against an oak and let her knees weaken for 3 seconds. Only 3. Then she kept climbing. The descent was worse. The trail dropped through wet leaves and loose rock. Twice, Amos stopped to test the ground. Once, Red Jack stumbled and caught himself with a hard sliding step that made Clara's breath vanish. She wanted to hurry. She could picture the woman on River Road waiting for medicine, but hurry was how animals got hurt. Hurry was how people died. So she moved at mule speed. One hoof, one breath, one safe step at a time. By the time the mule line came down onto the high road beyond the creek, Clara's hands were numb, one sleeve was torn, and her shoulder throbbed every time she lifted her arm. A sheriff's deputy stared at the animals and the canvas bags. "You came over the ridge?" Clara nodded. "Can you do it again?" She looked at the wet, tired mules. "Yes," she said, "but not fast, and not heavy." The deputy stepped aside. "That's still more than anybody else has got." By noon, heart medicine reached the woman on River Road. By afternoon, veterinary supplies reached Mason Pike's hill lot. By dusk, cattle feed, batteries, bottled water, and canned goods had crossed the ridge in panniers instead of pickup beds. The next morning, Clara took a bigger line. By the third day, she was running 3 careful trips, rotating animals, checking legs, keeping loads light, and writing every run in her notebook. The same people who had laughed now waited beside the trail with lists folded in their hands. They no longer joked. They helped lift sacks. They kept their voices low around tired animals. The county extension agent returned, but this time he carried a camera instead of advice. "I owe you an apology," he said. Clara tightened Amos's strap. "Then write it down where it helps somebody next time." So he did. He measured the trail grade, photographed the pack saddles, copied her load charts, and asked Walt about the 1973 flood. By the end of the week, people who had never cared about the ridgeline cut were calling it an emergency access route. For 8 days, the mules kept the west side alive. They carried feed to stranded cattle, medicine to stranded people, generator parts, fencing tools, powdered milk for calves, and dry bedding for a lambing shed. They moved slowly, but they moved when nothing else could. On the 9th morning, Mason Pike came to Clara's barn with mud to his knees and his hat in his hands. Floodwater had ruined his lower hay storage. 80 head of cattle on his west ridge had less than a day of feed left. "I was wrong," he said. Clara looked up from the load list. Mason swallowed. "I saw cracks in that bridge last year. I told myself it would hold because I needed it to hold." Rain tapped the roof between them. "My father lost land because he waited too long to admit what was coming," Mason said. "I thought you were doing the same thing." Clara studied him. "And now?" "Now I think I mistook remembering for refusing to move on." Clara did not smile. She only looked at his list. "How much feed?" "More than I have a right to ask you to haul." That wasn't the question. Mason gave her the number. Clara chose the steadiest animals and led the mule line back into the rain. That was the day the town stopped laughing. Not all at once. Harlan County was not the kind of place that apologized easily. The change came in smaller signs. A man at the feed store loaded Clara's truck without a joke. The banker called and asked for updated income records. The diner owner sent sandwiches for the mule line. The sheriff's deputy began calling the ridge path the Whitcomb route over the radio. When the water dropped and temporary bridge repairs began, the county counted more than 100 mule loads carried across the ridge. No one on the west side went without medicine. No cattle were lost to hunger. Clara earned enough in hauling fees and emergency payments to cover her overdue loan installment. It did not make her rich, but it stopped the bank from taking the farm. More than that, it changed what people saw when they looked at Whitcomb Bend. They no longer saw only worn-out bottom ground and a stubborn young woman. They saw high land, where a forgotten trail could save a community. They saw old animals with work still left in them. That summer, the county applied for a rural resilience grant. Clara helped map emergency livestock and supply routes across 3 ridges. She used the first grant money to repair the mule barn roof. She used the next payments to rebuild fencing, gravel the barnyard, and buy winter hay early. By fall, the mules were no longer auction scraps. They were a working line, brushed and fed, and known by name across the county. In October, the banker walked the ridge with Clara. "I still don't understand how you saw this coming," he said. Clara looked toward the creek. "I didn't see the flood coming." "Then what did you see?" She thought of her grandfather's map, her father's trembling hand, Bluebell's first step on wet limestone, and the bridge shuddering before it broke. "I saw what everyone was depending on," she said. "Then I asked what would happen if it disappeared." The banker said nothing for a while. Then he nodded like a man reading numbers he finally believed. By winter, Clara had paid the overdue balance, secured a smaller equipment loan, and kept the farm out of foreclosure. She planted the lower field in deep-rooted grass, letting it hold floodwater instead of fighting it. She restored the creek buffer with willow and sycamore starts. She spread mule manure over the thinnest hay ground. Slowly, the farm began to look less like a place waiting to be sold and more like a place being understood again. Walt lived to see the old sign hung over the barn door. On a cold December afternoon, Clara cleaned the dust from the faded letters and fastened it above the entrance. Whitcomb Mule Line, since 1973. Mason Pike came by that same afternoon with a load of good hay. He helped stack the bales, wiped his hands on his coat, and looked up at the sign. "Should have remembered that sooner," he said. Clara looked at him. "Most people forgot." Mason nodded. "Not anymore." No crowd gathered for that moment. No reporter recorded it. But for Clara, it mattered more than every apology that had never quite been spoken. The sign did not mean the farm was saved forever. Farms were never saved forever. There would always be another storm, another bill, another broken machine. But Clara knew survival did not always come from the newest tractor, the biggest loan, or the loudest voice at the feed store. Sometimes it came from a grandfather's map. Sometimes it came from watching a creek after rain. Sometimes it came from 29 old mules nobody wanted, stepping carefully through mud while the modern world waited on the wrong side of a broken bridge. Years later, when spring clouds stacked dark over the Ozarks and creek water began to rise, people in Harlan County still looked toward Whitcomb Bend. They knew Clara would be checking the trail, oiling the straps, and listening to the animals shift in the barn. Clara never made a speech about it. She did not need to. Every time Amos led the line up the ridge, every time Bluebell stepped calmly over wet limestone, every time hoofprints appeared in clay above the floodwater, the farm spoke for her. Whitcomb Bend had not survived because Clara proved everyone wrong with words. It survived because she trusted the land, honored the old knowledge, and gave 29 unwanted animals one last purpose strong enough to carry a whole community across the water.